Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Hélène Landemore, Assistant Professor of Political Science. Her research interests include democratic theory, theories of justice, the philosophy of social sciences, and the history of thought. Professor Landemore is currently working on a new project on democratic innovations in post-representative democracy. She has just published an article on the inclusive and partly crowdsourced constitution-making process in Iceland, and she is involved in the design and study of a crowdsourced legislative process in Finland. She also is researching the question of democracy in the workplace. Today we talk with Professor Landemore about rethinking democracy in the 21st century. Welcome, Professor Landemore.
Thank you.
So your recent work is working on democratic innovations in post-representative democracy. What do you mean by that?
So I should say a few words about my previous work
Okay.
first to sort of frame the question. My previous work was an exploration of the connection between the inclusiveness of our democratic decision procedures, the fact that we try to include as many votes and voices as possible, and the ability of those decision procedures to produce good outcomes, good laws, good policy. I was doing that from a rather theoretical, formal perspective, and now I'm interested in exploring more empirically, more inductively, actual experiments that have been conducted around the globe to include the voices of real citizens directly in the political decision process.
Okay.
So I've been involved in, I've studied and been involved in a couple of those. I've studied the Icelandic process that had this crowdsourcing moment in the key drafting of the new constitution. I've also been involved in the design and implementation of a crowdsourcing experiment for policy making in Finland in order to reform law on off-road traffic, basically the regulation of snowmobiles, if you will.
Okay.
And finally, I've also looked at experiments in the workplace meant to involve workers more directly in the decision-making process.
All right, let's go. Let's talk about Iceland first a little bit, and just what is crowdsourcing exactly?
So crowdsourcing, there are many definitions in the literature still somewhat competing because it's a very recent word and concept. It dates back to 2006. But I like to think of it as just outsourcing to a crowd. So that is to an agent that is neither known or vetted, nor vetted ex ante, contrary to what happens typically in classical outsourcing. So you don't know who's going to show up, you don't know their identities, you don't know their competencies, you don't know their gender, you don't know anything. And it's usually for tasks that have to do with ID mapping, problem solving, coding in some cases, and it's usually done online as well.
Okay, so this group of people, how many typically would it be?
Well, it's not that many. You would imagine that if you open up a platform online, you could get potentially millions of people showing up. In fact, it's usually a couple of hundreds to a few thousands, maybe.
Okay.
Never more than, I mean, at least as far as we've observed, it's between 1% and 3% of the population. So it's usually a self-select group of very motivated people.
Okay. And what are the specifics of the Iceland situation?
So what interested me in that experiment is that for the first time in history, really, the writing of the social contract of a country was made as inclusive as possible of actual citizens. So, you know, if you picture the American Convention, you know, in Philadelphia in the 18th century, it was basically 55 white men in wigs, an elite, a social political elite, who gathered, you know, for a few months in secretive meetings. And the people really were asked to ratify the document. You know, they had only the option to say yes or no, but they didn't have a chance to give their input. And this time around, the Icelandic people decided to do something very innovative. They, at many levels, this was very innovative, but crucially, the writing of the document was partly crowdsourced in the sense that the 25 members of the Constitutional Council, who were themselves actual citizens, not regular citizens, not public officials, not appointed officials, not experts in any way, wrote their drafts, successive drafts, and posted them online on a specific internet page and also on a Facebook page.
So this is the constitution for Iceland. They're rewriting it.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
they did that over a couple of years between summer of 2010 and the spring of 2013. And unfortunately, the experiment failed because the parliament shelved the draft, and so it was never passed into law.
But it was an interesting look at the possibilities of using crowdsourcing for various policy-making decisions, right?
Yeah, and in that case, a foundational document that would govern the lives of the Icelandic people.
How about Finland? Tell us about the work there.
So Finland, it's a project that was started in January 2013, and as far as the researchers' part is concerned, ended in last fall. And this was an attempt by the Finnish Parliament and the Finnish Ministry for Environment to crowdsource the reform on off-road traffic. That
would be ATVs, that kind of thing?
ATVs and snowmobiles, essentially. And because they couldn't come up with a good bill, so they thought, okay, why don't we try out this new thing called crowdsourcing and ask the snowmobilers and the landowners, the two parties sort of...
who are at odds?
At odds with each other in this specific law, what they thought of the law, what was the problem with the law, and how they would go about fixing it. So they put my colleague and co-author Tanya Itamurto from Berkeley University in charge of creating a platform and implementing a design for that thing. And then she brought me on board in spring last year, and together we've been implementing the design and studying the results.
Okay, so by implementing the design, what do you mean?
Well, basically, we created the platform, the questions that were asked. She did most of the interaction with the participants, being Finnish herself. And then we gathered the data on, the kind of answers we got, the kind of problem identified, and how they would go about solving them. Right. And then we wrote a report for the Finnish government. So there were three steps. One was really asking people what they thought were the problems with the law. The second was the problem, the ID gathering for solutions. And then the last phase was actually feeding back the solutions to the crowd and asking them to rank and evaluate them.
I see, okay.
So that's what we did.
Very interesting. So how many people participated in that process?
So the first two phases, the problem mapping and ID mapping, about 700. And the last phase, I think a little bit less, about half that, I think.
So I am curious, how do you get those 700 people? Do you put an ad in the paper? How does the public know about this?
Right. Well, this is partly the task of the Finnish Parliament and affiliated bureaucracies to sort of advertise for that. That's actually one of the sore points, both in the Icelandic case and the Finnish case. How do you get the message across, right? And I think in the Icelandic case in particular, the media didn't cover it enough, so that limited participation. In the Finnish case, I know that my colleague Tanya Itamurto did really a lot to get the word across. So, you go through associations of snowmobilers, you try to get the word out, but Facebook, etc.
Right. So what was the outcome?
So the outcome, the experiment is not completely over in the sense that we are still waiting to see if the Parliament, the Finnish Ministry of Environment does anything with the input we sort of reported on. Hopefully in the next few months we'll have a sense. There are a lot of resistances, bureaucracies are hard to change. And so, but the results, as far as we are concerned as researchers, is that the crowd is smart, they came up with a lot of innovative ideas. And when we asked them to rank them, they typically ranked the most outrageous or simplistic or unfair ones at the bottom. For example, not including any compensation scheme for landowners, or reducing the age limit for snowmobile riding to 9-year-old or things like that. They came up with very interesting ideas, like, for example, one that we thought was great was using GPS devices installed on snowmobiles to track the most used routes, and then use that sort of geographical indication to create the official roads there. But it turned out that even though it was really a clever idea, we thought, when we asked the community of the crowd to rank the idea, they didn't like that idea at all. Because another thing to notice about that experiment is that, of course, crowdsourcing is based on self-selection, so most of the participants were snowmobilers themselves, and they have a very libertarian ethos. They don't really want to be monitored by the government, so they don't want their data to be, used. So.
Okay, very interesting. And then the third thing you're working on is the workplace, democracy in the workplace. So tell us about that.
So democracy in the workplace. So one thing I should say about the whole project of post-representative democracy is that I think it entails thinking beyond two conceptual roadblocks. One is the idea that democracy is just about representation. It can only be indirect in mass societies, right? And I think, in fact, we should rethink direct involvement of the people. Not necessarily along the lines of ancient Athens, but some ways. The other one is that we have this idea that democracy is just a political concept that applies only to, the political sphere narrowly defined. But I think it needs to be expanded to the economic sphere as well, and specifically the workplace. So what I'm doing with my co-author Isabelle Ferreras from University of Louvain on this issue is to explore the arguments for and against democracy in the workplace. And in particular, the objections to an analogy that's often made by advocates of democracy in the workplace between the firm and the state. So that's the last project that I'm involved in.
Okay, and tell us about it.
So we've considered a number of objections, 7 of them so far. One of them is, I thought was actually very compelling initially. It's got to do with the fact that, usually when you talk about giving some control to the workers, people fire back by saying, well, but the firm is the property of the shareholders. Why would they, surrender any kind of control? That's the thing. And it's a completely false conception, it turns out. In all legality, the shareholders only own a certain number of rights associated with their shares, but they don't own the firm, they don't own the corporation. And besides, the legal rights that they have are conventionally defined. They could completely be redefined in different ways. That's what happened in post-World War II Germany, for example, when the state imposed this regime of Mitbestimmung, co-determination, in which the workers have almost an equal say in the management of the firm and the business decision and the strategy as the board of shareholders. So it can be redefined in any way you want.
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say my guess would be many corporations would not want to have the workers involved in a more democratic manner, or would it be in their best interest?
Well, so using my previous work on the epistemic properties of inclusive decision making, I would actually make the case that yes, they could benefit.
In what way?
Well, they could tap the collective intelligence of their workers. I think there's a great loss of human capital and human intelligence in the way in corporations in the way they're currently organized, because workers do information retention. They're not motivated. Why should they care, right? They're not given a say, a voice, so they do the minimum amount to get paid and get ahead to a degree.
Okay. So what does all of this work you're doing mean in terms of how we see democracy today? Right. When you speak about crowdsourcing, I think that's a wonderful idea, and I think it is great to get as many people involved in the process as possible. But then, for instance, when you look at the number of people who come out and vote, for instance, it's minuscule. So how do you explain that kind of thing?
Right. So that's a very good question. Yes, indeed. And I think a lot of my colleagues in political science spend a lot of time criticizing the citizens for being irrational and uninformed and apathetic. But in fact, I think it's a case of blaming the victim, because if you want, the lack of involvement is endogenous to the institutions we have, by which I mean that people have no incentive to go out and vote or care about politics, because their voice makes no difference virtually. It's one vote in a million. Plus, in the current system, at least in the US, with gerrymandering and what happened is that it's not the voters selecting the representatives, it's the representatives really selecting the voters. Right. So they're doing the reasonable thing, they're staying home, they don't really have an incentive to care. And I think these democratic innovations that I was talking about are a way to involve them and give them a reason to care. And in the experiment in Finland, for example, we've observed that people care. Another thing, though, to go back to the question of how many people participate, and it's still a small number, and that connects to the economic aspect of this, is that they don't have time because they're busy with their lives and they have to earn, a living. So another part of the reform of this the reform program that sort of comes along with this notion of post-representative democracy is to give back people the time and the opportunity to care about politics to a degree. Doesn't mean meeting every day. But
right. It is very difficult to be really up to even voting. You have to try and familiarize yourself with the candidates.
Right.
To understand the issues takes amount of time. So I think that time is going to be needed for people to make intelligent decisions.
Right.
So do you think crowdsourcing is on an upward trend?
Well, I think it's certainly very fashionable in recent years. So the thing is, we don't know enough about it yet. So that's why it's very important to study it.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more information about Professor Landemore and her research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.